And we just ask that you all mute your lines during the presentation. And if you have any questions, you can either type them into the chat box, but we'd really love is to open it up at the end for a discussion. So after the presentation, I'll ask you to unmute your line if you have a question, and we'd like to have a good discussion. So our presenters today, Joanne Pizzo and Bruce Schmidt, are registered architects. They each have over 30 years of experience in the A&E industry. And Bruce and Joanne also work with fellow architect Barry Eisworth. Barry's on the call today too. And they're all located in our Philly office. So this team is pretty special in that they've worked together for decades. They've worked with colleges and universities, both across the country and internationally. So they provide not just master planning services that they're going to talk about today, and they've actually completed over 40 master plans, but they've also completed architectural design services for buildings on those campuses, playing a crucial role in helping institutions plan for their future. So today, Bruce and Joanne, they're going to walk you through a brief history of campuses, campus planning, and the long-term benefits that conscientious campus planning brings to every institution. And then, like I said, after the presentation, we'd love to open it up for questions and discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the presentation over to you, Joanne and Bruce.
Thank you, Renee, and thank all of you for joining us today for a brief presentation on campus planning. You'll notice on here some musical references on this initial slide, which is sort of unusual for a discussion about campus planning, but hang on to those, especially this idea that every campus has a melody. We'll get back to that. So today we're going to discuss what is campus planning, especially the physical campus, why even bother to do it, and what are some of the benefits. And ultimately, campus planning is about creating memorable space and place and creating an ideal community of living and learning. I mentioned all those musical references on the previous image. I'm an architect and planner now, but early in my life I was a professional musician. That's me on the left, a long time ago and far, far away. We showed this material to a colleague as we were putting this presentation together. She is an architect and planner and knew I had been a musician in my previous life. And when we got to a discussion about how every campus is unique, every campus has its own flavor, even character, she immediately said, well, every campus has a melody, and it was one of those aha moments. It's that tune you can't get out of your head. It's the memory of that place that you take with you. And the house was a house I discovered as a 10th grader in an architectural journal. I immediately fell in love with this house, the plan and the image. They both seemed very musical to me, and even on the right photograph where the structure has a very rhythmic look to it, where it comes up from the ground, climbs up the ceiling, something like ivy reaching for the light. And so you could say that I fell in love with the melody of this house. And then years later, I'm in a new job in a new city, a new orchestra, driving down the street one day, and there's the house. The owners became good friends, and when we built a new concert hall and they decided to photograph every principal musician in the orchestra, there was no doubt about where my photograph would be taken. Again, melody and memory. So we can talk about the analysis of academic programs or athletic prowess or scheduling or classroom types and usage. We can talk about any number of human endeavors or philosophies or the simple paucity of parking that seems to exist everywhere. And all of these are very important part of the analysis. But the physical appearance of the campus, I think, is by far the most influential and memorable experience of any campus visit. And it's that melody that I mentioned, that melody that sticks in your head. And it's a powerful recruitment and retention tool. Any successful plan requires that we solve and resolve multiple issues in ways both big and small, and in ways now and across multiple tomorrows. We also have to solve issues that are measurable and unmeasurable. And above all, we must create not only a plan, a simple plan, but also a vision. And while any plan, especially the analysis of information, requires being very specific about things, any plan needs to have an inherent flexibility built into it because circumstances will change. So again, precision work required, but Here we have Philadelphia architects Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown comparing planning to fitting like a mitten as opposed to a glove. Lots of wiggle room.
So long-range planning includes the understanding of the current uses and the long-term goals of the size of the institution as well as its function. That will create the form of the campus. The culture and character will create the image of the campus, maybe the melody of the campus, and of course understanding the environment in which all of this takes place. Planning creates a vision that determines stewardship, land use, new buildings, renewal, and the definition of exterior space, again creating that memorable campus. Good planning requires periodic reviews. Things change. Presidents leave, teaching methods change, regulations change, land becomes available, pandemics occur. So visions change, and therefore the master plan should be revisited every so often. A lot of institutions update every 10, 12, or 15 years. Some update at 5-year intervals. It depends on the size, the financial acumen, and the habits of the institution. Some are required by law to update at specific intervals, and usually that's a location requirement. But again, plans can and should tie in with the institution's academic plans, the financial plans, and whatever other plans will serve to evolve and to sustain the institution. The institution and the professional are in a symbiotic relationship. The institution brings certain information to fore, the professional organizes and elicits and confirms additional information, as well as brings their professional experience. Meetings are organized, many committees, subcommittees, surrounding community entities, all a kit of moving parts that eventually includes engineers, more specialists. All of this must be vetted and organized to define the ideas and goals.
So any campus plan involves a multitude of moving parts, and especially in the beginning, there's an overwhelming amount of information and choices that need to be addressed. If we do this here, what happens there, and way over there? So let's face it, it's complicated. We employ a proven 5-step process that you see here, and this is a framework, a scaffolding, and it organizes the development and implementation of the final plan. This is not a straight line process. The whole thing is a bit like herding cats, and we often need to circle back to pick up strays, if you will. Again, in the end, we must have a plan and a vision. Here we have more detail than what was on the previous slide, and this sort of puts out the idea that there's a series of meetings that happen throughout this process. It's a highly choreographed dance. Lots of interviews, lots of workshops. We're involving administrators, faculty, students, staff, even the local community. With COVID-19, we're going to have to change the dance a little bit, but not the choreography. This is still very important. We're just going to be gathering this information in different ways. Clearly, there's going to be more virtual activity in gathering information and even in some of the presentations of findings and recommendations. So as I mentioned, every plan needs to be aspirational on all levels. And again, the core idea is the creation of a strong community. And it's an ideal community that has been described by the former Yale provost, Richard Broadhead, as, and I quote, a community that is unified by a sense of the beauty of excellence in its multiple forms and the pleasure of striving to attain it.
So why plan? Again, as we've noted over time, things change. Several factors influence and drive the master plan process. Different institutions put different emphasis on any one of these factors, and priorities may be different at different times. Most important, though, is the strategic plan. The campus is the physical manifestation of the goals of the institution as spelled out in that plan. And some thought should be given to the campus plan while the strategic plan is being discussed and developed. These days, we see some different aspects to master planning. Security issues, technology issues, green issues have come to the fore. And as all of you are aware, COVID-19 has forever changed the way institutions of higher learning will operate. All of this, however, considered, makes for a more comprehensive master plan. Again, why plan? So yes, everything we've said is all well and good, but why formally plan? The process can get messy, it can cause controversy, it can get complicated and time-consuming, even expensive. But a planned campus, a beautiful campus, creates wonderful spaces on campus and creates memories for students, creates a distinct community of learners. These memories and that community link that student forever to a place they experience at a critical phase in their lives. Think about your own experiences of your own campuses. They become tied into the institution, and as alumni, they carry memories with them forever, that melody, always repeating. They become a part of the place, space, and brand. So Charles Dickens noted that the American university or campus is a compromise between town and country, and almost as if each had met each other halfway, different from what we've seen in the past.
So for rural campuses, that means cities in the country, or for urban campuses, we have the country coming to the city. Part of the tradition of American campus planning comes from Europe, obviously, and we can go back to the Middle Ages with the continental colleges, and we're only talking about Western tradition here, but for instance, Bologna in Paris, the college at that time, the university, was definitely an institution in the city. There was no campus as we think of it today. This is a place where you went to learn only, and it's usually considered of several scattered buildings. It could be anywhere in the city. And they were, again, classrooms only. Where you ate and where you lived was not their concern. It was simply instruction. The English model added a live-learn relationship to this whole thing, Oxford and Cambridge especially. It's sort of a monastic model. It's very self-contained, and each college has its own closed quad or even a series of closed quadrangles that are linked together. Those quadrangles, there's one gate, there's one way in, one way out, basically, and this gave them control over students, some of them starting when they're only 15 years old, and it also gave them some control when there were disagreements between students and the town folks, in a typical town and gown dispute, so they could close off the college itself. This system became known even in the 1600s when we started building colleges, the collegiate way, especially the idea of living and learning all together. The American college on the bottom of the sheet is a much more open institution, and typically, especially in the beginning, it was one building, and from that idea we get this idea of Old Main, one building that contained every function. The American college are much more dispersed than their continental or English cousins, and they're much more extroverted as campuses. Probably as many campus types as there are campuses themselves, but for the sake of organization today, we're going to break it down into informal campuses and formal campuses. In the informal campus, there's many types of spaces, probably many types of buildings. When you look at the campus, especially on a drawing, it looks like it's not organized at all. It is, it's just harder to see because it's an informal relationship. The formal campus usually depends on strong axial relationships, and your eye and your mind follow those axes and make those relationships between buildings and spaces much more obvious. There's much more hierarchy also in the formal campuses, and there's usually a building in one area that's clearly more important than the buildings around it. Now, over time, these formal campuses tend to break down on the outer edges, and so you have a formal campus at the middle of the campus, the original campus, and then you have sort of an informal campus around it. But it's the formal campus, the original axial campus, that's melody, and that's the melody that's remembered by people as they walk away.
The famous Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier visited Princeton University in the 30s and noted the metropolitan quality of American campuses. Princeton is a good example of an informal campus. It's big, it's an entity unto itself. It's a small city within a small town. It sprawls, it's grown in a seemingly ad hoc manner. However, the buildings are arranged in a fashion that creates several beautiful small open areas or squares or gardens, and many of the residence halls are arranged around a courtyard, somewhat resembling Oxford. This university, in my mind, is our most medieval version of a college within the United States. Lafayette is a typical example of an informal campus. It's got a random growth with a lot of acquisitions of small buildings. L-shaped, the one large quadrangle in the center feels superimposed at a later date, and there are a series of smaller greens and courtyards that kind of knit the campus together. And our third example, Catholic U, is a somewhat unusual example of an informal campus. It's a linear campus. Usually, again, campuses are more compact. The university's library and one of the oldest buildings, McMahon, share the one very large quadrangle and the one true axis on campus with the National Shrine. Buildings are more or less randomly situated, but since the late 80s, early 90s, there's been a real push to create these landscape buildings or landscape places amongst the buildings that, again, knits the campus together.
So here's our friend Le Corbusier again, and again, someone traveling from overseas who's noticing this idea of a combination of a city and a garden, if you will. Very strong. So the formal campus, probably the preeminent example in this country would be the University of Virginia, which is the second planned campus in the country, and it was the pride of Thomas Jefferson. And it was this accomplishment was only one of three things that he wanted listed on his gravestone. And in fact, this idea of a city in the country, he called this complex an academical village. So a series of buildings around a lawn, very formal lawn. The buildings on the side, of course, being classrooms and living spaces, and the library at the head being the most important building in the composition. Jumping ahead to the 1930s, we have this small liberal arts college in Vermont, Bennington College. Again, it's the formal lawn with an important building at one end and smaller buildings along the sides defining it. And like UVA was in the beginning, open at the end so you could see out into the countryside from the formal lawn. The buildings on the side of this one are kind of interesting because they're like large Vermont farmhouses, if you will, white clapboard tiling and multi-paned windows. And finally, in Houston, Texas, in the 1950s, Philip Johnson's did the plan for St. Thomas University. And again, there's this long lawn in the middle with smaller buildings along the edge and a larger library at one end. This lawn was open at the end for years, and then finally, late in his career, he came back and he added the chapel and closed off the far end. That's the chapel at the upper right there. So when you come to a campus, you're into an established world. This is a campus that has a long heritage probably already. It's got a lot of traditions that you have to learn about. And you need to address the pre-existing culture of that place. You need to respond to that pre-existing condition. In 1967, Ed Bacon published a book called Design of Cities, in which he talks about the principle of the second man or the second person. And he features in this one an undeveloped area in Florence, the Piazza della Annunziata. It had a church at one end that you could see at the bottom on the left that had been there for years, but it was unfinished like many an Italian church. And finally, they hired Brunelleschi, who was the architect who figured out how to put a dome on the cathedral. And in 1427, he finished what was called, on the right-hand side of the photograph, the Foundling Hospital. This is considered the first building of the Renaissance. 20 years later, the church decided to finish their building, and over 2 phases, they added to the front of the building on the square, and they looked to the Foundling Hospital to take their vocabulary. And you can see the church on the left of the photograph in the rear there. And finally, 87 years after that, 2 more talented architects show up to do the building opposite the Foundling Hospital. We're standing on the porch in that photo, and they basically simply copied the Foundling Hospital, and suddenly we had a very highly organized and highly regular Renaissance plaza I would admit this is an extreme example, but it gets the idea across of looking at what's there already. Another example of the second person, Beethoven here is being talked about by Frank Lloyd Wright, and he's comparing architecture to music, saying a symphony is an edifice of sound. On the right-hand side of this, we get this idea of the second person again. We've got 2 pages from the score to the Beethoven Third Symphony. This is the view the conductor would have while conducting. And on this score, we have the instruments listed in a certain direction, in a certain way, and in a certain order. There's a certain notation used, and all the instructions are in Italian. And now if you think for a minute that Beethoven is German, why are the instructions in Italian? Simple tradition, because Italians had developed all this music theory probably 400 years before Beethoven arrived at this point. So the conductor-performer is arriving at this music as a second person, as we talked about in the previous slide. You have to accept the tradition as a framework or a scaffolding, and the performers build, in fact, an edifice of sound at each performance. Those performances could be mediocre or they could be transcendent, but tradition is never seen as an impediment to the progress of anything here. Because in this case, tradition is not the worship of the ashes. Tradition is keeping the fire alive.
The irrepressible Ben Franklin noted that if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. That is definitely not the case with Bucknell University, which we'll be looking at rather intensively over the next several slides. Jens Frederick Larson was a very prolific architect. After attending Harvard University and becoming a World War I ace in the Royal Canadian Air Force, he became an architect specializing in a relatively new field, that of campus planning. This kind of grew out of the City Beautiful movement and the new landscape architecture movement. And as a planner, Larson influenced the planning of several of our major colleges and universities, some of which are listed here. He was also the author of a seminal book on campus planning. In 1932, Mr. Larson went to Bucknell. Bucknell was founded in 1846 as the University of Louisburg and became Bucknell in 1881. In 1932, a fire destroyed a portion of one of the oldest buildings, Robert Hall, and Larson was hired as a consultant to advise the university as to what to do with this building. He ultimately recommended that the building be rebuilt, and he eventually became the campus planner. He established a direction of growth at Bucknell, and a large number of subsequent buildings, again listed here, were based on his vision. And with these buildings, I should note, following the planning principle of the second man for an astounding 33 years.
So here's the plan that Larson came up with in a very short period of time, probably about 5 months. Most of the previous campus had been down the hill, if you were, in the lower left, and then up along the left toward the river in the upper left. But they had established, right before the Civil War, they decided to become a college on a hill, which was a popular movement at that time. And there's a left-right axis on here, and on the left side there's a C-shaped grouping of buildings. Those buildings are at the top of a very steep hill to the left, and that axis left to right follows the spine of a slope that slopes off gently to the top of the drawing and gently to the bottom of the drawing. He then put in this vertical axis, top to bottom, and at the intersection of these two axes, he put what was going to be the most important building in the composition, and that would be the future library. Below that library, there's an area that would become the academic quadrangle, and that's defined on 2 sides by academic buildings, in fact. So this is the campus that he discovered. Again, you see the buildings sort of down below the slope. Those green hatches on the left are a very steep slope, an unbuildable area. And we have in green the proposed quadrangle. So by 1941, at the start of the war, they'd added some buildings, engineering building at just above the horizontal axis, and the small building right to the left and below the intersection of these two axes is the Vaughn Literature Building, and that building was constructed using the insurance money from the fire that Joanne mentioned. And you can see this is the first building on this future academic quad, which is literally the signature of the campus even today. There's a long way to go. 1948, after the war, they managed to put a small addition on that same building. By the way, this green area was graded almost immediately as they started this plan, so there'd be, if you will, memories of days to come. Anybody who walked by there would be aware of the fact that this will be a future defined quadrangle. 1950s were a big area of activity. The right side of the quadrangle at Coleman Hall was a huge move on their part to define that. And then just above that and to the right, there's a new residence hall to start moving more people to this side of the campus. And of course, right at the intersection of everything is the new library, which went up in 1951. And finally, between 1960 and 1965, they completed the quadrangle. Again, it's 33 years of following the same plan and going for the same goal. This all takes a lot of time, and clearly there were a lot of people that had strong belief in this plan. And the plan continues to have an influence on subsequent people. Both Barry Eisworth and Joanne and myself worked with another firm, and in 1999 we interviewed for a new campus plan for Bucknell University. And this is the campus as it existed when we arrived. And whatever we may do in organizing buildings, it certainly helps when an existing campus has some character going forward already. Here's 3 photographs from the Bucknell campus. This would have been, again, buildings that we discovered when we arrived. At the bottom is a view toward the library and that academic quad that they spent 33 years putting together. Another one of the buildings that define that quad is in the upper left, and the upper right building is in yet another location. But they all share the same brick and limestone trim. They all have white trim at the windows and doors. They all have multi-light windows. They all have the same basic pitched roof, and they're all basically the same scale and proportion. And above all, they're all loosely Georgian. So these are all part of the melody, if you will, of the Bucknell campus, and it's a strong recruitment tool. At the interview, we had 8 goals and issues that we stressed, and we felt strongly about these, that these were important issues to get to the bottom of. And once we were awarded the contract and started doing research about the history of the campus, we discovered that all 8 of these had already been covered and thought of as important in the 1932 Larson Plan. It's good to be in good company. So on the physical campus, clearly there's diagrams we do to study the existing situation, and Bucknell was no different. One of the most important things for them was this idea of edges. And there's a busy highway on the right-hand side, you see, and over time, somehow several academic classes had leaked across that highway into an ill-defined area on the other side of the road. At the bottom, there's a cemetery. That's not going anywhere. And the lower left, there's the town itself, and that's hard to deal with. And probably even harder to deal with is the river to the upper left there. The other edge that was very interesting on this was to the upper right, and that was a farm that had been there for ages. They had an opportunity to buy it in 1948 and passed on the opportunity. But we were certainly encouraging. That was the one safety valve they had as far as more space. There were some sacred places on campus, sacred spaces that we or no one else was going to be building in. On the far left was a grove of trees that had been there since before the university was there. There was the green, the first green that Larson noticed up the hill there in this C-shaped group of buildings. There was the academic quadrangle we talked about, but there was also this area called the lawn, the big oval at the bottom of that area. And this was simply an open area that had been there for ages. It was a place for students to gather. It sort of became the beach in the spring, if you will. And it was recently decided to replace this area. You have to mow it, you have to water it, you have to put fertilizer on it. It's going to be replaced with trees and native grasses. In other words, it's going back to what it started as. And this is part of their program of environmental sustainability. It'll certainly help with carbon sequestration. It's going to be help with the reduction of chemical runoff because we won't be fertilizing it anymore, and it'll certainly improve the biodiversity of this area. Strengthen the center. The center of the Bucknell campus is already very strong, very striking. It's the thing we remember when we go away, but we felt that there was even more work that could be done in this area. Again, I mentioned these academic classes that have leaked across the highway. The idea here was to bring all the academics back to the core of the campus and then redevelop this area in the lower right-hand side as a strong area for recreation and athletics. And of course the river, this is the western branch of the Susquehanna River. This is a large river and it's right at their doorstep, but basically they were turning their back on it. So we were trying to get them to connect with the river psychologically, visually, even pedagogically if they could. And we encouraged this buying of the farm, which they eventually did do. This was very important to them because they were trying to become, they were a residential campus definitely, but they were trying to become even more of a residential campus to get as many undergraduates as they could back onto the campus. So on the left-hand side is our plan of the year 2000. That's just 20 years ago. And we instituted a loop road, and there was perimeter parking that went with that. We made the center of the campus much more pedestrian friendly. And we actually proposed 2 new quadrangles. The library is basically right at the middle of that. The academic quadrangle is below it that we've talked about before, that you can also see in the lower right-hand corner. And we proposed a new quadrangle above that. You can see the 2 yellow boxes there defining that quadrangle. That quad has just finished this year. So again, it was a 20-year dream. On the other side of the library, we created another quad rather quickly, actually, over the summer. It was a faculty parking lot. It had been designed as a quad by Larson, but it turned into an 83-spot faculty parking lot. And by simply taking out the pavement and putting in grass, they already had mature trees. It was already surrounded by buildings, and the lighting was there. They had quickly had yet another academic quadrangle.
So in 2008, there was a subsequent plan, and as did the master plan, this subsequent plan followed many of the goals and parameters set up by the original Larson plan. It aligned with the strategic plan of the university, their self-defined goals, and it added a few additional layers, a 30-year plan, a 75-year land use plan, landscape and architectural guidelines, and even stormwater guidelines. There were some minor deviations, or maybe we should say augmentations, per our earlier slides and discussion. The 2008 plan extended the quad, creating the new quad at the east, continuing the idea of strengthening the academic core centered on Larson's centrally located library. And it planned for additional and expanded athletic fields to the west, proposed additional campus green spaces to link diverse campus communities, and reinforced the previously proposed engagement with the river, region, and town. These moves serve to enhance Larson's plan and to continue Larson's original vision and plan into the present day, again keeping the principle of the second man alive and well.
So we said on the first slide, every campus has a melody. There are certainly changes that happen over time. Society changes, teaching methods change, learning styles change, and technology certainly changes. And then we throw in pandemics on top of it. So what we have and what we think survives is melody, which is what Stravinsky is saying here. And we equate melody with memory, always looking for a harmonious campus. So every campus has a melody. They have an existing tradition and culture, and then you have a memory of that place that you carry with you when you leave. It's that thing you remember. And we have the theory of the second person, which is an attitude about designing, about adding to and augmenting what already exists and becoming part of the family. And finally, all this done well, we create space, place, and brand. And you have a campus that inspires the faculty, the staff, the students, even the community, who all want to be part of a memorable community of learning.
This ends our presentation. We thank you for joining us and for your time.
All right. Thanks, Joanne and Bruce. So at this time, we can go ahead and take time for questions. As I said in the beginning, you can either put them in the chat box and I can read them out, or if you feel comfortable, you can unmute your line and just ask away.
One of the questions I know we've always gotten, Renee, is how do we gather information? And ways of doing that are many and varied, and it depends kind of on the institution also. But we will meet with any and all committees. The university usually has a voice in setting up which committees are available and how those committees are set up. We usually have staff and administrators, an academic component, a student component, a facilities component, and we schedule meetings. They might overlap, these various groups, or they may not, but we'll schedule meetings. We'll vet everything and anything. We'll do pinups. We'll even take a large map of the campus, spread it out on the floor, and work directly from that if need be, or if desired. And that usually sparks some creativity. And we will meet with community groups as well as the university groups. We're digging for information. The university, as we mentioned it during the show, will often give us a lot of information that we vet, and these groups that we meet with are part of that vetting process.
So I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Carl Pettit at William Patterson University, and we all know the coronavirus has really put a very different spin on the way of delivering our education curriculum to distance learning and remote learning. And even beyond that curriculum issue, the cost of education has also been challenged a lot as the politicians discuss, making education much more affordable. So the issue is, how is this going to affect our campuses and our whole sort of investment in the whole physical plant almost? And finally, beyond that, where are we going to employ people in the future, in an ever-changing world? That's a very loaded question, but see if you can answer it.
Wow. We actually started looking at this early on, and we actually wrote a white paper, which is published on our website. I come at it from two directions. I come at it from the architectural field, the planning field, and I'm an adjunct professor at a local institution in Philadelphia. And yes, it's been very interesting. Everything has gone online, and I know the university I work for is currently trying to figure out what they're doing for fall. How to open, are we going to kind of team teach, or, have half the students in on Wednesday, have the other half of the students in on Monday or Friday, that sort of thing. So it's definitely become an issue. Certain things will change. I mean, there's definitely going to be a lot more physical, I don't want to say barriers, but there will be the guards and things that are up, the plexiglass guards will be up. There'll be less people in groups, definitely. People are looking at how to rearrange furniture in communal areas as we speak. As you enter a building, you probably will be checked colleges and universities are trying to set up methods for monitoring and isolating anybody that does become sick. So that may change how dorms are used, how residence halls are set up. So there's a lot to consider, and I know every college and university in the United States is working very hard on coming up with protocols for all of this. But again, physically, I think is what you're asking, Carl, and what we're focusing on. There will be definitely physical ramifications to the campus.
And it may be that there's one door is for going into the building and another door is for going out of the building, and even to the point of one stairway might be for up and one stairway might be for down, that we don't have people passing each other. We're also looking into the fact that we've in the last 2 years, something I hadn't thought of before, we're discovering campuses that say they have too many buildings.
Right.
And so we're starting to do some studies of, okay, rather than just tearing the building down and leaving a big hole in the campus fabric, what can we do with this building? What other purpose can it serve and still be part of the family of the campus, even though it might not even be a campus function anymore?
Yeah, that's the struggle, and indeed, our buy-in to the college campus as a solid idea, I think, is getting challenged a lot. Just what you said, I guess that was Barry, but do we have too many buildings? Are we teaching? How are we going to change our curriculums to meet a very different world in the future in terms of how we can keep people employed with relevant jobs and stuff? I mean, that's really the spinning question, and I don't have any answers.
Well, it's once you start predicting the future, you're usually wrong. So it's all we can do is keep our minds open and our heads clear, and move along as best we can.
Yeah.
All right, do we have any other questions? Anybody else want to unmute your line and ask a question? We have Barry, Bruce, and Joanne with us.
So we had a question last time that had to do with where do aesthetics come into this. Here we are trying to figure out how to keep the place open, and we're talking about aesthetics. But Bucknell is a good example where they have their own brick, they have their own paint for the trim, and everything is loosely Georgian, and that's basically their design guidelines, as opposed to, I've done work at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, or the University of Colorado at Boulder also, where it's a 3-ring binder that probably has 200 pages in it of design guidelines, including at Boulder, where they use a certain building stone. It can only come from 1 of 2 quarries, and it can only be a certain color range, and the joints have to be this, and the stack pattern has to be that, and you can only turn a corner 1 of 2 ways. So every campus is different, and you can go from the Bucknell example to Boulder and everything in between.
And I think, too, that, some of the campuses, maybe even some of the ones developed in the late 40s, early 50s, early 60s, there's kind of a lack of character on some of those campuses. And one of the ways in which we look to unite or unify that campus is through the landscape. And I was just thinking about how the landscape is almost like the melody that one overlays on a campus and just starts to knit buildings together and tighten up the experience of the campus as a person moves through it, so that, it feels more unified, feels more almost like a well thought out, a well-oiled machine.
And Joanne, I think back to Carl's question about COVID, talking about knitting a campus together, but at the same time, I almost feel like COVID is pushing people apart. I don't know.
Yeah, it is. And one of the things I taught online for the spring, we have quarters, so the spring quarter, I asked the students, I did a kind of informal poll one day at the end of class. I put aside 10 minutes to do this and just started asking them various questions. And one of them, I was like, what do you miss most about the campus? And they were, There were two answers. There was one about the physicality of the campus, and that was just kind of moving through campus and being open to experiences as you move through campus. And the other was that they missed the interaction within the classroom amongst each other, and even mentioned they missed the discipline of having a set time. I mean, obviously, we're on Zoom meetings and they have a set time to show up for class, but just the physicality, I guess, of moving to a schedule and moving through a campus and moving into a classroom where they would interact with other students. It's a very interesting conversation.
And cheesesteaks on the corner.
Yeah, cheesesteaks.
All right, do we have any other questions? All right. Well, hearing none, you can always reach out to Barry, Bruce, and Joanne. And for those of you that joined us today, we're going to send out the recording of our webinar. And we just want to thank you all for joining us and appreciate your time. If you have any questions, please let us know. Have a great day.
Thank you.